If you have a teen who is thinking about or preparing to apply to college, you are likely aware that some colleges and universities say they are test optional or even test blind when it comes to ACTs and SATs. Well, what exactly does that mean? Should students with learning and thinking differences who struggle with test taking take these standardized tests? Well, my guest today, Annika Guy, is going to answer those questions and discuss the changing landscape of college admissions in the test optional era. Annika is the Director of Independent Study and SAT ACT programming at Hayutin Education. I am so glad they are joining us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by ChildNEXUS.
Hi, Annika.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so good, and I'm so glad to be speaking with you today. I just love the work that you and the team at Hayutin Education do. So thrilled to have you as a member of this ChildNEXUS community, and I'm so eager to talk about what we are going to talk about today because it keeps coming up. We're talking about test prep, and you, in your role at Hayutin, you focus on independent study, homeschool, and SAT, ACT programming, which is, again, really part of what we were talking about today and what I want to talk about today. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about it is because there's so much confusion about test prep right now. Since COVID, a lot has changed. I think there were some changes being made before COVID, but after COVID, a lot changed with respect to ACT, SAT, and test requirements for colleges and universities. I know that you have done a great deal of research in this area, and I would love for you to kind of talk about what it is that you've learned and any trends that parents and even educators should be aware of.
Yeah, it's so much has changed. We're all seeing that. We're all living that. And it's continuing to change. It hasn't stopped changing. We haven't yet reached a point where we can say this is the new normal and it's going to look like this next year too. It's continuing to evolve and everybody's just sort of pivoting and trying to keep up. And so I do like to be really transparent about that with all of our families and with parents who talk to us about test prep because we keep up, we research, we stay really educated on it. But even we can't say, what is this going to look like in a year? What is this going to look like in 3 years? Which is hard because you are testing before you're doing your applications, right? You have to make that call before you have the answers really about what things are going to look like. And that's obviously really scary for families to be making those decisions. And there's a lot of conflicting advice that we're seeing. There's still not really a consensus among college counselors, test prep companies, all of us who kind of work in this space and advise families on whether to test or not. Everybody isn't really saying the exact same thing. So if you call 5 people, you could get 5 opinions, which makes it even harder for families. So it's like, who do you trust? Who do you go with? Who's right? And it's partly because there isn't necessarily one right answer. Yeah, so it's really hard.
And it seems that it really is an individual decision depending on who your teen is, I guess, if they're thinking about applying for universities and colleges, and also their unique needs, their experience with testing, and the schools that they're applying to, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the list is essential, which again is hard because students tend not to have that firm down until end of junior year, summer before senior year, even fall of senior year. They're really nailing down that list. And you've usually started testing before then. So we've had students who, felt pushed into testing, went through with all of it, and then realized, oh, I actually only really want to apply to, UC schools and other schools that not only are test optional, but many are test blind and won't even look at your scores, right? You can't even submit scores to the UCs. They won't look at them. And so that can be frustrating to feel like I did all that for nothing. And it's not that it was for nothing. It's just you didn't know. Your list might have had schools where it could have mattered a little bit more, or at least schools that would take the scores and review them. So there's a lot of kind of making your best guess, going with, again, each individual decision. Who is my teen? Where do we think they're looking at going? What do we think they're maybe going to need? And just making your best decision from there.
Right. And I think even the terminology is helpful for listeners. You mentioned test blind and test optional. And I think people are probably more familiar with the test optional. Can you talk about what it means when a school says it is test blind or it is test optional?
Yeah, that's a great question. So test optional means you don't have to submit scores, but you can, and they'll review them as part of your application portfolio. Most test optional schools right now are saying very firmly that it will not disadvantage you if you don't submit scores, that it's not, test optional, but like you should really do it. They are saying we are truly optional. You are not disadvantaged in any way. The tricky thing is we are seeing at especially more competitive selective schools, kind of the elite schools, so to speak, that their admitted student rates tend to have a very large percentage, a disproportionate percentage of students who did submit scores. So maybe 25% of applicants submitted scores. Then of the students who got in, say 50% were ones who had submitted scores, which makes families, of course, feel like, well, it's not really optional then, right? Like it looks like this matters a lot. And it's hard to say whether that's true. I understand why the data is so scary to families, because that would worry me too if I was a student applying right now or a parent of a teen applying right now. But it's just as possible that those scores are correlating with other things, that the only students who submitted scores were submitting incredible scores. And so those gave them a boost. And it's not that your lack of scores got you knocked out of the park. It just gave somebody else a boost who had them. It's hard to say. It's so hard. There's conversation about, does this correlate with GPA anyway? Like, is this related to other things? And it's hard to say because, again, the colleges are saying, no, it's truly optional. We're not disadvantaging students at all who aren't submitting, and you're not disadvantaging yourself if you don't submit. But then the data, right, it scares people. It feels like that maybe is not entirely true. And so I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from for parents with the test optional schools. And then to go back to the question you asked, test blind is schools that will not look at scores. Like you don't send scores. They won't look at them even if you have them. They won't consider them in your application at all. And so for those schools, like there's truly no disadvantage to not testing because they wouldn't look at the scores anyway. So that it doesn't matter at all. So those are the ones you don't have to worry about not having test scores forever.
Right. And so when parents are looking at schools for their teens or looking with their teens for schools, is that information something that is readily available? I guess when they're looking through the application process, they will let you know we are test blind or we are test optional.
Yes. So that information is readily available. And there's a website, I believe it's fairtest.org, that has just a list, and they update it as soon as that information is available for each school for the next application cycle. So it can be hard to predict though, right? The junior fall, say, when you're starting to ask yourself, am I testing? Am I not? Because some schools, some colleges and universities have committed to being permanently test optional or permanently test blind. Said, this is our new policy forever in perpetuity. And then there are others that are still kind of reserving the right to bring it back. Maybe next year. Like this year, we're going to be optional, but we'll see about next year. And so then that's harder because you don't know if they're going to bring it back.
Right. Now, for many of the families in our community, their kids struggle with taking tests. Many will say that their children do great on projects. They do great with hands-on demonstrations and presentations, but because of their learning or processing challenges, taking tests is hard. And when they do take tests, their scores don't reflect their true abilities, their true potential. So like you were saying, one question that comes up and the concern and the fear is that when schools say tests are optional, they worry that it could hurt them. But what I'm hearing from you is that they're not disadvantaged for not taking the tests at all. And so when students are trying to make that decision on schools and whether to take these tests when it is test optional, what are your thoughts about, ameliorating some of the concerns, but then also providing students with the guidance they need to make that decision?
Yeah, it's a conversation we have with every family that comes to us with that question. And it's a conversation that takes into account sort of everything else that's going on. So we think about, have you done a practice test? What are your baseline scores? Do we know where we're starting? That tells us a lot about where we can go and what's realistic and whether this is potentially going to be worth it or maybe not going to be worth it, right? Because one of the few downsides, I would say, of the test optional movement is that because students cannot submit their scores, the median scores at colleges for submitted tests and admitted students have gone way up. They just skyrocketed because nobody's submitting low scores anymore, because why would anybody submit a low score now if you don't have to submit your scores? And so then that means that what might have been a pretty good SAT or ACT score, a respectable one that you could submit to plenty of schools 5-10 years ago, isn't going to be that anymore at a lot of these schools. And there's not one single score threshold that's a true rule of thumb. If you get this score, don't. If you get this score, do. Because it depends on the college. It depends on the rest of the student profile. But it's generally higher than it used to be, which is scary and hard. But also, I think in some ways freeing, because it does make it easier to walk away. You can say, oh, I'm not going to be able to break 1,400 on the SAT. And the schools I'm looking at, the medians are so high that this isn't worth it. I'm just not going to try. And I love that they have that option now, right? We didn't used to be able to do that. When I was in school, we all had to do the SAT or the ACT, and we had to submit to go to college. So I think that overall, this is absolutely in neurodivergent students' favor, that they don't have to test and that they can choose not to test, even if it has brought in all of this confusion and uncertainty about what to do. So it's hard and it's stressful and it's scary for everybody, but it's ultimately a good thing.
Yes. And do you get a sense that we're kind of moving, the colleges, universities are moving more toward the test optional and maybe even test blind way of doing things?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's increasing awareness among colleges, among universities, of just what a blunt instrument the SAT and the ACT are, how flawed they are as tools for determining whether students can be successful. There's also obviously a broader societal awareness as well of the equity issues related to the SAT and the ACT and the ways that, insisting on test scores and having strict test score expectations or requirements has really hurt DEI efforts by colleges and has really held back the diversity and inclusion of a lot of universities, especially top universities in the country. So I think that's the direction we're headed, at least with the SAT and the ACT, pretty firmly. Whether they'll be abandoned entirely is a different question. We'll see. We'll see. I think the big changes that the SAT is undergoing actually this year are kind of tied up in everything else that's going on here. I think test companies are seeing the need to adapt to changing times and are aware of how perceptions are shifting about these tools and what they do.
Right. In addition to, changes with regard to being test optional or test blind, are there any other changes or trends that you're seeing, maybe even in the structure of the test itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the ACT is changing very little. They're kind of building out their space in the college admissions test landscape as the sort of the reliable standby. You know what to expect with the ACT. SAT has done more changes over the last, I'd say, 10 years. It's just gone through more kind of renovations by comparison. And the big one that's happening right now is the shift to the new digital SAT, which, in addition to being digital and taken on a computer instead of on paper, is a totally different test as well. They're making huge changes to the length. The reading, writing section has gotten a complete overhaul. The math section is changing a little bit less, but there are some notable changes there. So it's a very different test. It's going to be a lot shorter, which is great. And so a lot of families especially families of neurodivergent kids, are very excited because one of the hardest part of these tests is that it's a marathon, especially if you have time and a half or double time. Your 3-hour test is now 6 hours. How is anybody going to do that? Especially a kid who probably got that double time because they have a hard time focusing. And so a big part of the appeal for families right now with the digital SAT, which is rolling out domestically in March, is that it's shorter. So it's going to be 2 hours and 14 minutes, not including breaks, compared to the old full 3 hours that it used to be, which is great. is going to be a lot shorter. It is. Other changes, the reading section used to, well, currently still does, have like one long passage and then you get maybe 10 questions on it. Now it's going to be one short passage for each question. So you're not expected to do that same level of synthesis, deep reading on one passage, answer so many questions about a passage, which if there's a passage that you find really difficult could really hurt your score because there were so many questions based on it. Now it's just one shorter passage for each question. So if there's a passage you didn't really get, less of an impact, right? On the other hand, it's a lot more cognitive switching from question to question. You're having to just pivot much, much faster. And you can't do that deep dive in the same way. So some kids will find that easier and some will find it harder, just depending on how their brain works. So that's one example of a change. There's many other changes they're making to the test. We're tracking all of it. It's really interesting. I'm excited actually about the digital SAT's potential for students, especially students who have learning differences or neurodivergences. We're a little nervous about it this year because it is the first year of the rollout.
Right. It is so new.
It's brand new. And I'm hopeful that I'll be wrong, but I'm expecting there to be rollout issues. I think there'll be tech issues. There will be, computer charging problems. There will be issues with there's a computer lending program. If you don't have a device you can use, you're supposed to be able to borrow one from the College Board to address that equity question of just expecting everybody to have a laptop that can do what this test requires. But I'm expecting there to be issues with that. Yeah, there's just a lot of question marks about this first year. We're really short on materials. There's just not a lot out there in terms of practice tests and content. It's slowly being published. It's coming out, but there's just still much, much less than we have for the old version of the SAT, which is still the one that's in action until December this year, as well as the ACT. We know more. We have vetted materials. We've been doing this a long time. If you're doing test prep with a tutor, they know the test backward and forward. They've been doing this. Like, it's really known. And the digital SAT just presents a lot of questions.
Right. And for our neurodivergent students who may have had struggles with test taking in general, throughout their school year, throughout their school, experience. For those students who absolutely want to go to a school where those high stakes tests are required, are there strategies that are helpful in helping them to prepare to take those tests?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, so there's a couple different things that go into a really effective test prep plan for students. One, if you can afford it, is test prep with a tutor or classes, things like that can be really valuable for the teaching and the coaching. Obviously, that's not accessible to everybody because it's expensive. So there are things that anybody can do on their own. Practice tests are one of the best tools in an arsenal for test prep. It's so important for just practicing the stamina piece and the pacing piece. How am I keeping track of my time throughout each section? Am I realizing when I'm behind? Am I realizing when I'm rushing? How is my energy going throughout these? Am I just crushing the first section and falling off as I get deeper into the test because I'm tired? Of course, I do find that students who have extended time accommodations have the hardest time making time for practice tests because that can mean sitting down for 5.5 hours on the weekend and just self-monitoring a practice exam, which is very, very hard.
Yeah.
Incredibly hard. And parents can help with that if they have the time and they're able to be around and kind of semi-proctor it while doing other things. But it's a lot to ask of a teenager to spend 5.5 hours on the weekend taking a practice test, or 4.5 hours. It's not a small thing, but it is one of the best things you can do. And there are quite a few free practice tests available. So that's one really good way to do it. And then you can buy like the Princeton Review book, some of the other company books, the official books from either the College Board or from ACT. And those have a lot of helpful tips and strategies as well. And often something that ends up being important is content review. You might be struggling on the math section because your grasp on the geometry or the algebra 2 wasn't that deep yet, or wasn't as deep as these tests are expecting them to be able to work that quickly. So it's usually a combination of what are our strategies, what are our tricks, how are we kind of approaching this test strategically and thinking about almost gaming the test, right? How are we kind of playing the test in the same way it's sort of playing us. But also, do I know the math? Is my reading comprehension at the level it needs to be? Is my vocab where it needs to be to tackle these passages? And then there's a lot of strategies that can help for, when you don't know a word, when you don't totally remember a math concept, but you don't want to be trying to use those on half the questions on the test. You want to be applying those to a kind of a set of exceptional questions, ideally, if possible.
And that's where taking those practice tests can really help in terms of identifying those content areas where a student might be weaker. So then they can get the additional support in those areas as they prepare to take the tests.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Practice tools are magic in many ways for this process.
And I know that you support students who are making this decision. What are some ways that you support families? Because it seems like this is a huge family decision. And oftentimes, students, and I have had this in my office recently, where the student is saying, I want to go to school A and B, but the parents say, oh, but I hope she goes to school C and D. It becomes this family decision. And in those decisions is also a decision about attending schools that maybe test blind, test optional, or require those high stakes tests. What are some ways that you and Hayutin Education support families who are navigating the murky waters of test prep in general?
That's a great question. So I would say transparency is a big one. I try to be very, very open about what we're seeing with these, about how much isn't known and all of those pieces. We are very comfortable with families choosing to test or not test. We don't recommend that everybody tests just to do it. We don't push people into it. We aren't like our company and I myself are not taking the line that everyone should test and that everyone even should at least try to test and everybody should prep, and that this is really still a very important thing that everyone has to do. We don't feel that way at all. And relatively few schools are requiring these tests at this point. It's a pretty rare list of schools where you'd be in a position of really having to test. Most often, what we actually see is families feeling the need to test because they feel that there's something that has to be made up for in the rest of the student's history, right? Maybe there was some classes that didn't really go well. Maybe there was, particularly maybe it was before diagnosis and before they had the tools and resources to understand why they were struggling and how to get the accommodations and support that they needed. So maybe freshman or sophomore year or both just went poorly. And then there's a fear that they need to make up for that by having these test scores, even if maybe the GPA isn't as strong. But can I get the test score that sort of rules that out or balances that out? We see that a lot. We see it in students who maybe had a gap. They had to take time off for one reason or another during their school trajectory. And then that creates a hole. And they're like, well, that's a red flag to colleges. So now I need a legitimizer. All of those things come into play. We see homeschool students are one of the few demographics that actually really does have to test. If you weren't enrolled in an accredited high school, you have to test, which is tough. And then a lot of international students feel a lot of pressure to test because, they need to prove their English literacy. They need to prove whatever their GPA was from the school. They feel a stronger need, and college counselors for international students tend to encourage it more. So it's rare, I would say, actually, that the reason somebody feels like they need to test is because of a particular school on their list requiring it. That would be the exception for us, at least. Athletes are another category that sometimes feel they need to test, recruited athletes. So it's hard. It's definitely a tough question. And we talk really openly with families and students about what test prep entails. We talk, particularly if people are thinking about working with us, we talk a lot about time and treasure, right? What is this going to cost in terms of our energy and our bandwidth for our student? And then what is the actual price tag going to be if you're doing formal test prep services? And what's worth it to one family and what's worth it to another, for the same score goals could be totally different. And we do usually tell families, I say we always tell families this, and I found that college counselors and school counselors are generally aligned on this too, is that test prep should always come last on your list of priorities for junior year. So it should never come before your classwork for schools. It's more important to keep your GPA up and do well in your classes than it is to be doing test prep. It shouldn't come before your extracurriculars. You shouldn't be, quitting a season of sports to do this. You shouldn't be giving up everything else that's going on in your life to do it. It's, so if there's room to add in the test prep, okay. But if it's going to come at the expense of anything else, I usually say that that's probably not going to be worth it.
That is some really great guidance for families who are, again, trying to make decisions about allocating time, determining whether or not they want to spend that time. It's something that would be beneficial for their teen to do at this juncture. And, you provide a lot of information to families who may not have known their options, may not have known that the landscape of testing has changed considerably and continues to change. And, if families want to reach out to you to learn more about, the decision-making process, whether to test, to not test, or about your ACT, SAT programming, and even the educational support that Hayutin offers, because some students may choose, okay, we're not going to do the test prep, but I really need to pull up my grades for my junior and senior year. Can I get some educational support around that? And I know that Hayutin provides that as well. What is the best way for them to connect with you to learn more?
That's a great question. There's so many ways to reach us. Our website is an easy one. We have a contact form submission. Anybody can go there and just fill it out quickly, and we'll try to get back to them within 1 to 2 business days. They can always call our phone number on the website. Any of us will reach out. We do offer a wide range of services in this space, including the academic support, the SAT, ACT support. We also do help students work on the applications themselves. We have a lot of families who work with us for college essay support, just dealing with the EF, the executive functioning demands of the college application process, right? Just organizing those deadlines, the back planning. It's a lot, especially when you're busy during senior year. It's not a small thing to ask the kid. And kids are applying to more and more schools now. It used to be, when I was in school, I think 10 to 15. Now we're looking at 15 to 20 as the average. It's a lot. It's a huge amount of work.
That's a lot to manage with a course load.
Yes,
right?
Yes. We often tell students to think about their college applications as an extra class. In some cases, even almost like an AP class if they're applying to a really big list of schools. So it's a huge thing to think about your senior year. And if you're trying to take a really rigorous senior year course load too, you're loaded up on your APs and your honors, and you've also got fall sports. It's really hard. It's really hard to fit it all in. We usually recommend starting college applications over the summer before senior year if possible.
Yes.
Whenever possible, just to lighten the load on that senior fall. Otherwise, it can just be too much.
Great advice. Yes, absolutely. You definitely don't want to be waiting until, it's too late and it's crunch time in order to get that done. Because in addition to the academic demands of your senior year, there are also a lot of social things that you want to be involved in as you're preparing to transition to post-high school life.
Yeah, it's supposed to be fun. I think we forget that. Your senior year of high school is supposed to be fun. It's your last year of high school. It's such a big transition to college, so much more autonomy and responsibility. I mean, if you've been at that's high school for 4 years too, maybe even if it was an upper school since 6th, 7th grade, is your friends, it's your last chance with them. You want to have a good time. It's supposed to be exciting. You're kind of on the cusp of something resembling adulthood.
Right. Wonderful. Well, Annika, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our listeners. I will definitely put a link to Hayutin Education, all the information that you all have, all the resources that you provide to students and their families in the show notes. And so again, thank you so much for being here. It's just such a pleasure. And I just hope that families will reach out to you because you provide a lot of valuable and important information and support to students.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on this. We love ChildNEXUS. It's been such a valuable resource and community to be a part of.
Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about Annika Guy and the services provided at Hayutin Education, be sure to check out the show notes. I will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by ChildNEXUS. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.